Hi, everyone. Can I ding? Luis, Shara, everyone at the back. Julius. It's all men standing and chatting. Hi, everyone, and thank you again for being so prompt with returning from all the breaks today. It's one of the things I love most about the RISE conference is that you gain incredible amounts of knowledge while in really tiny bite sizes and then stress for the rest of the week that you've forgotten most of it. My name's Laura, and I've got a great fun conversation lined up. There will be no papers on this session. This is your chance to ask all the questions that you've been asked or you've been thinking in your head all day. This is it's live and so forth, but say what you want to say and unpack it all. We're really going to talk about the shift from systems research to implementation science, hence the not so subtle demonstration effect of that through the 4 sessions today. And I think it is worth just stopping and reflecting for a moment. Those of you, and there are many of you in the room, who were around 10 years ago, which is a terrifyingly long amount of time. And I say kudos to the funders who give that link to the funding, first and foremost, but also... funders. Yay, funders. But also just the number of people who are still involved. And I think there were a number of us who sat around the table 10 years ago and said, we're not all going to be here in 10 years, are you crazy? And yet here we are. So I think that's testimony to the research that's been generated through this program. The questions that are being asked by this program are the ones that we're still asking today. Or I say that, and yet are they? Because some of the questions I heard today are still the questions that we were asking at the start of RISE. So the start of RISE was going back to Tessa, Justin, and everybody else's paper, thinking, well, sure, like an NGO can use contract teachers and the government can't. Like, how is that not working? Or, kind of seemingly obvious things that are done in education that don't seem to be working either at scale or just, as Paul demonstrates again and again, at all. And I think there are still some of those questions today. We're hearing a lot of organizations, people, researchers, practitioners still searching for this seemingly invisible, impossible thing called scale. But there are a lot of questions. I mean, I heard today even things like, we have suffered through, this is Renata saying, we've suffered through the implementation. Bela, you saying, were things designed to fail today? Ricardo, how do you create the political environment in which actors are going to support what's been designed? And I think those questions were there at the start of RISE. And one of the goals of RISE was to enable everyone, enable us all to take a step back and think about the system. The word system was very core to RISE at the start. So the conversation today is going to go through that journey of 10 years of questions, no pressure, and look ahead to what comes next. And we've had a few hints of that today. I'm not going to give big introductions to the 3 speakers because I'm sure you all know them well. But the various roles that they've played will come out, I'm sure, in the comments they give. It's going to be a conversation. I'm going to kick off with some questions. Feel free to jump in throughout, but really, I've got a couple of rounds initially, and if you've got a burning one, put your hand up, but otherwise, we'll come out and extend the conversation after that. And really, Mpumi, I want to kick off with you, because as many of you will know, Mpumi's got like a dream job, right? Working directly, overseeing research and ways to get research generated, used, and then into practice across South Africa. It's not the easiest job in the world, I can imagine, but one that really is connecting research generation to life. And maybe just as a sort of baseline, where are we then? My first question to you is, what are the questions in your and your colleagues' day jobs that you still don't think you've got answers for?
Too many. So I think firstly, we have a sort of formal research agenda that we've solicited across the department to ask questions on different aspects. So literacy, violence, parental involvement, nutrition, etc. So that's a public good, that's aligned with medium-term framework. So that's like the government plan, 5-year questions that sort of is static and publicly available. But I think aside from that, questions that still remain after all is said and done are some very specific ones and broader ones. Some of the specific ones are still, after participating in years and years of international and regional assessments, we still don't know what children know in the early grades. So I can tell you that 81% of children, according to Pearls, can't read from meaning. I can't tell you anything beyond that. So what do grade 1s and 2s and 3s actually know? And then how does that fit into strengthening the curriculum? So there's still questions around that. We still have big questions that have largely remained ideological around language. When should we be switching languages of instruction? Is the current policy appropriate or not? If you look at the African context, there's a lot going on, contradicting stories, lots of countries switching to English too early, in my opinion. UNESCO, which told us to switch in grade 3 years ago. And then current questions around, are we switching too early? Those questions have largely remained ideological. They're around politics and who's in power, and not really the evidence of when to switch. So there's a bunch of those. Then I have a second level of questions around when you are designing for a second intervention. So initially we had these RCTs, how do you teach reading for meaning for the first 3 grades, but how should we be thinking about teachers now? They've had some intervention. Do you have the same dosage, same depth? Do you come back in 1 year versus 3 years? What are the impacts you expect to see on the second cohort and the third cohort? So some of that. And then some long-term studies. Where are the effects of these early interventions that we've had? Do you see them later? And maybe a last version, which is a slightly higher level. How do you get things like the Auditor General, who is a watchdog in the state, of the state, to not just measure inputs, but to measure outcomes? And how do you scale that up? How do you get Treasury to be driving, delivering outcomes instead of telling us to cut teacher budgets? So those are still bigger questions than like literacy or numeracy.
Sometimes I think the word system and the system's challenges make it feel like everything is a problem. And then how do you drill? I mean, because the answer to any one of those questions feels like it's a research program in itself, yeah, right?
Absolutely.
But why is it then that you think you're not getting the answers?
I mean, some are, like I've said, ideological, some are around what evidence exists. So you have a lot of diagnostic work, but not a lot of interventions that are measured. So you know what would work at scale. And some of them are around political economy. They're not around education, actually. They're about the systems, how decisions at a broad level get made, what are trade-offs. For example, we have a presidential youth initiative that's massive and focuses on employment, but it's not focused on education. But we do have real unemployment issues in South Africa. So how do you decide whether you want to keep more young people employed or you want to half their numbers and use that money for education? So, yeah.
Yep. And Rachel, that, I mean, it makes me think a little bit of some of the conversations that we had. And for those who don't know, I was at the then DFID at the start of RISE, and Rachel was my boss for many years. I won't ask any incredibly difficult questions.
Or tell any embarrassing stories.
No, exactly. But one of the things at the start of RISE was not only about what the questions were, but who should be answering them, and to trying to bring people from different academic disciplines into looking at education. Economists obviously being one large cohort, but also some of the really exciting stuff that I've loved through RISE has been some of the anthropology, the public admin, the Mark stuff, you know, on innovation. Like, there's been some really interesting angles coming at education problems. And you at the time had a graph that set out, this is the state of education research. My feeling today is we don't have, as a global education community, a view on the state of education research today. But given that you were the kind of author of that graph, where do you think we've come from then? And I guess a little bit about what's RISE's role in all of that been?
No, thank you. And maybe the clever IT could put the graph up for you, because I think, you know, we actually have made incredible progress. And sitting here with Lant, I think it's actually testimony to an economist who was prepared to listen to the anthropologist. You know, Yamini, I think, is probably one of the people you often talk most about, Lant, and I think that your convening of an interdisciplinary group has been quite phenomenal, and I think it genuinely has shifted the game. And I think, Laura, also we had at the time on the axis at the bottom, we talked about quantitative research, and that was mainly economists, but there weren't so many of those. There were fairly few studies at the time, and I think one example of how far we've come is actually if we think about the JEEP panel and the Global Education Expert Advisory Panel and the Smart Buys report. Just in the last 2 years, between the last report and the one we have just put out, 250 new studies that are in there, 47,000 downloads of those reports. I think it's quite phenomenal that we've really grown that body. And I think also on the other axis, from micro to macro, we were mainly doing lots of micro studies, particularly the qualitative side. We weren't really talking about scale. We weren't really looking at things through government systems. And I think all credit to the RISE community and all of you who've been part of that, trying to really shift how we do that and what we look at. And so I think that's been key. And another indicator of that, do you remember, and I think we've got Christine Beggs in the audience here, and I think we've got Lewis Crouch, USAID and the bank at the time, and the UN. There were just 4 of us saying we needed to increase the quality of evidence. And Maria somewhere, who was coordinating it all, Maria Brindlemeyer, over there, 4 members. It's now 40 members, Laura. And 6 interest groups, because people aren't content with just having the general panels. They want to deep dive into the topics, early childhood learning, teacher professional development, climate, education in emergencies, and so on. So I think that's been one area. I think what's also really fascinating has been the evidence uptake as well, and what's happened there. So RISE has shifted the narrative, and I think it's partly because there've been those different voices. The WDR 2018, I think the fact that the RISE conceptual framework has been so influential in some of these and thinking about learning trajectories. And for many, they were talking about access and they weren't talking about learning. And we can forget that 10 years ago, particularly donor-driven programs weren't thinking about what happened inside the classroom. And I think, I don't know who's here from the India team, but having just had the privilege, there's Abhijit, having just had the privilege of spending a month in India, it was really telling that the 2020 new evidence, the Education Act, is very informed by all of the research that Abhijit and Kartik and others have done. And that having academics who genuinely engage with policy is, again, a really unique thing. But perhaps, I would say, the most exciting thing, and I know this was part of your vision and your push, having come from the work in Bangladesh, what about the governments and change at the government level? So I'll just tell you a little story. Who here's been to the Education World Forum at all? Okay, quite a few. The largest gathering, as Laura well knows, of over 100 ministers from around the world. And this year, it was actually, it just fell after the day of the King's coronation. So London was in a buzz, and we were in the big forum with glass windows, and we were overlooking that Westminster Abbey and a boardroom. And there you had, the usual ministers around the table, and the fabulous Sally Grantham-McGregor inspiring them about early childhood. And they were looking, intently at her, because of course they weren't really doing much on early childhood. And they sat back and said, "So do you mean what we've been doing is actually a bad buy?" And Rukmini, of course, jumped right in and said, "Yes, actually," with her usual frankness. Luckily, Halsey was in the room from the bank, and in his diplomat, he said, but yes, but you could turn it into a promising buy if you, along with your laptops, you add in some teacher support and coaching and so on. So, but I think what was great about that was you're actually starting to get ministers and, of course, their entourage they bring in the delegation, thinking more deeply about the evidence. We weren't there 10 years ago, Laura. So, you know, I think that's extremely exciting. And Nick Sproul yesterday said, look, should we also have a different starting point? And this is your first C in your 5 acts, Lant, which I absolutely love and always land well in discussions with governments. But should we be starting with their priorities rather than what Stefan calls our theory of ignorance, where Stefan calls it that we're just assuming that those in power want learning, and that it assumes that they're waiting to be told what works, and that once they have that knowledge, they're going to act and everything's going to change. And I think that, you know, this is not necessarily where we, you know, where we know the truth is. And I think it demands a different way of working. So just to finish on that graph there, in the middle box, if you remember, there was mixed methods. And I think this research opportunity, we still have some way to go on that. I think there was some great work with the Ethiopia team, with the Vietnam team. You know, but Yamini yesterday, Yamini Iyer, a fabulous anthropologist, called on us yesterday. She said, look, let's not think of the qualitative as a nice to have that you report on, you know, you don't even report on, but actually that we have at every stage before we implement the RCT, you know, at the design stage, at the implementation stage, and at the analysis stage. And I think it's a really good challenge. And I think the other thing that we have started but need to build on, and I don't know where Claire Lever is, but you know, somebody who's always a champion of empowering researchers who are young and upcoming, and particularly researchers from the Global South. And I think it's wonderful to see sort of that sort of leadership from someone like Claire Lever to encourage that young people come and see them progress in their academic careers. And the way the community of practice, when you were using the, you know, the diagnostic tool, actually went out and called on them to help pilot that. I think another great example. And I think going forward with the What Works Hub, we need to do more of supporting that localization.
Thank you. Lant, I'd like to pose a similar question to you, because you've said before that from the start of RISE and many years before, the global community has known that learning has been an issue. Learning has been embedded into discourse and narratives on education. No one intended access to take over, right? But the starting kind of, I guess, line in the original business case for RISE was, we don't know enough about what works to improve learning at scale. Do we now?
So I'm going to ignore that question.
Surprise.
For a second. And because I was thinking about how to illustrate kind of where we are on the system versus implementation. And I want to tell a story of an unrequited love of my youth. Which was with a car. I love the Ford Mustang. I was born in 1959. The 1966, 67, 68 Ford Mustang was the dream automobile. You know, Steve McQueen drove a Ford Mustang. It was just so. And the Ford Mustang was the epitome of cheap oil and no concern about emissions. So to make a fast car, you just made a huge engine, right? And then all else was like around that. Then when I was 14, so just about ready to drive, all of this relationship with the Ford Mustang was imaginary, of course, to a teenager. The OPEC shock hit, price of oil quintuples. In addition, the environmental movement all of a sudden says, you know, our air is really, really dirty from all these cars. And so the automobile manufacturers were under enormous pressure, including legislation, to increase miles per gallon, increase fuel efficiency. So in 1975, my older brother's best friend bought a brand new 1975 Ford Mustang, and it was a piece of shit. It was the betrayal of my years of lust, because this is a little too personal, I guess, but anyway. But, you know, because the way the Ford had solved the problem of the trade-off of having a new objective of miles per gallon was they just put a 4-cylinder engine in a Ford Mustang. But without really a fundamental rethink, without any improvement in efficacy in the way the system was designed. And so it was underpowered. It wasn't fast, it wasn't quick, it wasn't sexy, it wasn't anything. It was a piece of crap. I am still, as you can tell, bitter about Ford Motor Company having betrayed my love. Now, what's the point, you may ask? The point is, a lot of what we're hearing is on the assumption we can just drop a modular component into an existing education system and produce a better system. And that, I think, is the overall, now I'm getting back to the actual question you asked. The motivating question, and I think the word scale gets people confused, right? The motivating question of RISE, it was, why do some education systems, as a result of the routine operation of the system, endogenously produce excellent learning outcomes and other systems don't? Now, that is intrinsically a question of scale, but it's not the question of how do we take this particular known thing and scale it in the system. It's the opposite of that. It's how does the system come to produce, as a routine as the routine endogenous outcome of the way in which the system operates, how does it routinely identify, assess, design, and implement programs in the system? So interestingly, as yet today, no one's used the word Vietnam. Now, Vietnam's a really interesting word because Vietnam achieves OECD levels of learning, roughly, at roughly the cost per pupil, at least in the past before education expenditures expanded rapidly in Vietnam with its economic growth. It was producing OECD levels of outcomes at roughly equivalent expenditure per pupil that many countries today already have. And so the question is, like, how the hell does Vietnam do that, whereas other countries with similar expenditures don't, right? So I think we are much further along in fleshing out what the functional characteristics of systems are, but they're not unique mappings of one-to-one of design characteristics. Right? It's, you know, functional systems do these things, but that doesn't elicit the granularity of how do these things get done. There's lots of ways to skin a cat, and so different functional cat skinning systems skin cats. Sorry, let's not go down there. Let's pick a different metaphor. Anyway, so I think we're more towards this, but when when we talk about implementation science, there's two radically different interpretations of that, right? One is the science of how do we get governments to implement what we think we already know they should be implementing to achieve desired outcomes. Mm-hmm. And that inevitably leads to deliverology type approaches. And the other is, what is the science of systems that, again, work such that they implement well and achieve the outcomes we want? And those are like radically different approaches. I call one, I was in a conversation where we're often in a situation where we've had massive progress in science, but we don't actually have a science of progress. Mm-hmm. Because we don't actually have a science of how does progress happen. So.
But I think in a way, the same thing has happened with systems research, and the word system has been interpreted and misinterpreted so many ways. I think, from the test last year to all these documents, I mean, almost every strategy now, from any funder, implements, the language, the zeitgeist language of the moment is systems. And it really wasn't 10 years ago. I'm not going to blame RISE for that, but...
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to blame RISE. I mean, the question is, I don't know. I mean, you got to get people to use the word, I don't know. This is a big question of a science of progress. Do you get people using the word system and then gradually get them to understand what the hell they're talking about?
But see, I think systems change has been interpreted as your first example, that systems change is to do something we already interpret and therefore need to mold the system to do.
Yeah.
And in a way, I've had the same question from, as you and the RISE team have been evolving the idea that started quite early on around coherence for learning and recognizing that purpose was going to be key, and that the commitment of a certain number of actors in the system was going to need to be there. My questions early on were, well, how do you achieve that coherence? Because I can see a way that would also be interpreted to be from an external actor, or indeed various internal actors within the system, with more right, perhaps, to say, well, how do we create it? And I think that is a sort of, I still have today a real question. Can we create coherence for learning? Can we create a sense of purpose in the system? Because who's going to tell any teacher or district education official that they don't have purpose? Can we create commitment not only to a certain set of policies, but also to the implementation? Is it possible to do that? And do you think RISE has helped us understand how to not have a future set of actors running out exactly trying to create that in wrong ways?
I mean, it's very old-fashioned joke about the TV show Lone Ranger. It was an American Western show. Lone Ranger was a Western cowboy who had a Indian companion. And the joke is they're surrounded by Indians, and Lone Ranger says, "We're really in trouble here." And Tonto says, "What do you mean we?" So when you ask the question, can we do X, Y, or Z? Like, who is exactly is we? And I think if we as people in this room, the answer is for sure, absolutely not. Uh-huh. Right? If we ask, can we, people in this room, contribute to assist at the local, national, state level, can we help people create this? Probably with a program of research and understanding what constraints they face. But, this is where the challenge of the what works hub and implementation is just radically orders of magnitude more difficult than RISE, because RISE was a research program and we produced research and we did a good job of producing research, but producing commitment is a really challenging thing. And you have to say, no amount of commitment from the global community is going to create commitment in South Africa or commitment in India that has to be created locally. So.
Mpumi, what's your take on that? Is there commitment to learning in South Africa? Can you create more of it? And is there, I guess, building off this sort of separation of a commitment to the goal versus commitment to the implementation that the last panel talked so much about, do you see a distinction? Is there commitment to one and not the other?
I mean, I think there's a commitment to learning. I think I'm yet to find what people have in their mind of when you think of a dysfunctional system, it means you stand at the gate and you just see everyone's running around in a school. People are sitting in staff rooms, children are at home. That's not what you see in a typical school. You walk in, they're all there, they're doing something. And I don't think they're doing it to just pass the time. I think there's a different idea about how to do it better, etc. And that can be shifted, but I think Lant is right around how you shift that. And I think we have maybe two examples. One is around a design failure, which Jacobus and Stephen were part of. We used to call it informed and empowered when we started. It ended soon in 3 months, and it was uninformed and disempowered when we renamed it. And it was essentially this idea, global idea, give schools information, give parents information, they'll make different choices. No, was never going to work. We learned, did a little qualitative study quickly, early. The principal was happy to convene parents the first time. And then once we presented hey, your school's doing worse than the school next door, you could be doing better, you have the same inputs, etc. The school principal just didn't call them back. And that was the end, finished. Does that mean that school principal wasn't committed to learning? Or were we using levers that didn't build credibility for the school principal and for what they may perceived our mission to be? I think that's probably what happened there. Where's a different example where we've had a successful intervention that worked. We did it with an NGO. We had training at the beginning of each term. It happened on time as planned. The current version is we're scaling up with a province and training happens, but there are lots of constraints and we've learned to live with that. That is the system. And so there are budget constraints, there are time cycles, academic time cycles that clash with financial time cycles, that clash with their other district programs. Do I think that means they're not serious about learning outcomes? No, I think they are serious about learning outcomes, but it's around how do we take our programs or ideas that we think work, get buy-in, but also be flexible about how they get actually implemented. And so I'm more keen to see the results from that rather than this external, everything's perfect, but you actually are not in the system at all kind of work. So yeah, I think there is a commitment, what it looks like, how you map it out, how you measure it, its timing are different depending on what level of the system you're working at.
You say that is the system, it is full of constraints. How in the design of something like that, and then the kind of testing of the early stages of it, how do you work out which of those constraints you can move? Which of them are movable and yeah.
I think that's in our case, the advantage of being in the state, that we have a better understanding of who the various players are. And there's some trust that they have around sharing what the constraints are. And it's just really engaging them on what they think is going to work. So, I mean, it's even things like, engaging them effectively. I mean, the curriculum policy says you should be teaching a 12-week term. If you speak to the actual subject advisors, they tell you you're wasting your time. You should probably aim for 8 to 10 weeks because in reality, there are assessment week, there are funerals, choir competitions, etc. And I mean, you could do the policy thing and have a 12-week curriculum that never gets taught. You could argue with them, let's make it 10 weeks so we can do a bit of extensions. But them feeling heard and accommodated in the curriculum means that they're your partners rather than in opposition to your curriculum and are actually implementing the curriculum rather than the design curriculum. Someone was presenting design versus implemented curriculum. So, yeah.
So you've just, I mean, I don't hear a huge number of examples around the world of one, really strong listening and kind of identification of various different people's views of what the problem is, but then also not policy design that tests it, brings it back and says, actually, after 3 months, as you say, disempowered, it's not, we're going to change the name, we're just going to stop the whole thing. Rachel, turning to you on the challenge, as Lant put it, the challenge of the What Works Hub and implementation science. Is that how implementation science looks like, to enable governments and practitioners to pilot something, to listen first, to pilot something? So it's the whole old kind of PDIA, test, learn, adapt model. How, I guess, two sort of sub-questions. How can a mostly research program come in to support the enabling environment in order to have that happen? And if it was so easy, and Lant has said it's not easy, then how has it not happened more already?
Big questions. I think let me start with the first, because I'd like to suggest that perhaps it's not just about the top-down trying to create the commitment, but perhaps it's a totally different model we need in terms of the bottom-up. And another little story, surprisingly, sometimes the most unexpected things happen in a building like this. The third floor, coffee room, BSG. Always good for a bit of extra caffeine, a bit of boost of the concentration, but sometimes also surprising things can happen there. And I had actually just been having a conversation with Kat Patillo, who had been telling me about the incredible example of Sobral, where if we talk about systems, that's where I think of genuine system reform, where you're thinking, you're talking about political commitment and trade unions and communities and your finance ministries. And Kat had shared that how they went from, at grade 2, going from 40% learning to 92% learning just in 3 years. And this is one of the poorest states in the country of Brazil. Incredible progress. So how did that sort of commitment happen? Anyway, back to the coffee machine. I was up there just minding my own business. And of course, suddenly there was Dennis from Lehman Foundation. I think you're always meeting amazing people here. And I thought, okay, this is my moment to say, it was just the start of the pilot for the What Works Hub, and we were testing different ideas. I thought, what about taking a group from a couple of our pilot countries, so Kenya and Pakistan? What about taking a group to see this? Because I'd found that as quite a powerful mechanism working in Nepal and India, that exemplars from the bottom up are often more inspiring than evidence from the top down. So I thought, okay, let's see if this works. And after a bit of persuasion, Dennis saying, well, we just do the scaling in Brazil. And I said, yes, but, sharing that lesson more widely, wouldn't that be interesting? Finally, he said, yes. And what was interesting is they said, no, it's not for you as the donor to go and then identify who should go in terms of the individuals. We'll do that. And actually, an anchor organization in the country will do that. And I was a bit like, oh, we're paying for this in my usual kind of tone. Okay, so we'll leave it to the anchor organisation. Unsurprisingly, the anchor organisations chosen ended up with independent criteria, independent assessment, ended up being PAL network members. Independent, respected, understanding evidence, but not politically aligned to any one partner. And for the first time, really, in my career, I saw a group of different peoples from different elements of the system coming together. What did they do? Lant, when you took everyone out of their comfort zone, and let's not forget how difficult this program was at the beginning, it was hard. And Lant used to take everyone out of their comfort zone and do things like go to climbing walls and make us all dancing. Do you remember the time you brought your wife to make everyone do some art? I mean, or the time I hated the most, which was that dreadful improv session. Oh my gosh, here in this very building, how to humiliate people. Well, anyway, Lant's way of putting people out of their comfort zone was much more pleasant now, on retrospect, than what they did in Brazil. They took everyone, and for 3 days, we went into the basement of some vanilla hotel in Sao Paulo. We didn't have a window in the whole room. And for 3 days, they started doing all this psychological, what's your worst characteristic? What are the traumatic things in your childhood? And I was like, what? And I was after 3 days, I was thinking, I thought we were going to see system reform. I thought I was going to see some classrooms and children. What are we doing? And however, there was a method in the madness. And those people who, when they walked off the aeroplane down the tarmac, didn't know each other and didn't really want to talk to each other, because the trade unions definitely did not see eye to eye with the teacher trainer lead or the Ministry of Finance member who was on that course. They walked back not only with common respect and as comrades, as we might say, but they walked back with a common mission and an outcome that they believed in, that was not predetermined by someone, but it was based on what they believed were the problems. And I think it was a really inspiring model that I haven't seen before. So what does that mean? I think that means that we do need a shift in culture, Laura. I think we need a shift in culture in how we use evidence. I think we need a shift in culture around using that to test, learn, adapt. And I think we need a shift in culture in terms of the local ownership of it. During the course, I was also told that I couldn't be a fellow. And I thought, well, but I believe in this change just as much. Why can't I be a fellow on this program? And I said, well, at least my Kenyan counterpart, they're Kenyan, they could be a fellow, and my Pakistani counterpart, they could be a fellow. Seeing Baylor's laughing over there as the anchor organization in Pakistan. No, you're still a donor, and you are usually dogmatic about determining the agenda. And this is a different model. This is a different approach. And it's about a locally owned and a locally led problem identification and solution. So I think it's really interesting. I think the challenge, therefore, perhaps for the What Works Hub is more about how do we then identify what technical assistance might be, demanded, and us being responsive to that, to help then with a gold standard, if you like, of the change that they're trying to enact. So ensuring your alignment, Lant, thinking about the Sobral. So the Kenyan team went back saying their mission was going to be to create a Sobral of Kenya. And they wanted at scale in terms of one district to try and model what they'd seen. The challenge is, you go back and you don't necessarily have the best assessment system. You don't necessarily have the teaching and learning materials. They may not be produced. They may not be being locally created. So how do you then provide the appropriate support and so on to help do that? And at the same time, help support sufficient evidence generation to do your test, adapt and learn, which again is a challenging thing to do. So
you've got me really nervous about the trip that some of us in the room are going on to Sobral in November. Get ready for your stories. But I want to put your challenge almost back to Mpumi, and if that is what the What Works Hub needs to do, if that's what implementation science looks like, getting researchers, practitioners, government to be working hand in hand almost, kind of changing that culture of practice in a way. Is that possible? What would it take? You've given 2 examples where you're starting to see it, but what we're saying here really, and what I'm drawing from what you're saying, Rachel, is that the change in the practice of evidence can help contribute in and of itself to improvements of learning. Do you think that's possible, feasible, and what would it take?
Yeah, I think so. So I think the first thing is research is still underfunded in general. I know even the work we do, which is a lot of work, has a lot of external funding. The internal funding is sort of for our salaries and hopefully, desktop work, analyzing existing data sets, but innovation, actually trialing things, piloting, doing the case studies, etc., needs money, actual money, which we often don't have in the budgets. And in times like now, we have budget crunches, which are in fact saying we should travel even less, intervene even more, less, monitor remotely, etc. So that kind of support financially is needed. I think there is a recognition around technical aspects of what we don't know. So I think most governments are open to, we don't know how to teach robotics and coding, if that's the thing you want to support. I'm not going to comment on whether you should do that. But there are technical questions that are unknown, and I think people are willing to admit that. There are aspects where people know something but need resources to deepen their knowledge. So for example, the teaching of reading in African languages in South Africa is not something we'd want to outsource. It's something you can fund that's happening in the country. How you roll out, etc., could then have some technical aspects to it. And then there's some behavioral research that we can bring that can be world-class around how you change people's beliefs, how much exposure do people need to start believing children can learn. What do we learn from coaching, for example? How long does it take for someone to actually change their practice? Those are things you can learn from the global north or other places. And then there's the recognition that's necessary from researchers, donors, etc., that they don't know everything, right? So there's a undermining or mutual respect that happens both ways. And that can be explicit or it can be implicit. You go to the training and you just keep doing whatever you were doing. But I think if we get to those kinds of things that are less like counting and ticking boxes and more relational, there is an opportunity for collaboration. It's a big need. We have scarce resources, we have large problems that need to be resolved, and best minds applying themselves to that is a useful thing. So I think definitely doable, but should be thought through carefully.
Lant, I think you have views on that question too, in a way, right?
I have views on lots of questions.
Well, yeah. I mean, take your pick. But will the study of implementation, from your point now, as sort of research director of RISE, looking forward to the questions, and as I say, we heard many, many questions today on implementation, many more, I think, on politics, I have to say, but I'm biased on that one. You know, there's a lot of kind of the politics didn't work, but can implementation be studied? Can that culture shift happen? Will it help?
So, strangely enough, I was just read a document that quoted me as saying something I had never said.
That's AI, blame AI.
But which I liked, so now I did. Which is that, you know, a discipline is a group of people who agree on what counts as a question and agree on what counts as an answer to a question. And a very serious problem, any commingling of what would be academically published research and implementation, is that there isn't a discipline in which you know, what these questions that we're answering count as questions. And in particular, there isn't a discipline that has agreed upon what counts as an answer to these questions that is sufficiently scientific, and my fingers just can't help do this, scientific and rigorous. And that is a first order problem. It's a first order problem because academia is completely, totally controlled by the disciplines. And so if you can't ask a world-class researcher as a junior, non-tenured person trying to make their way in the world to not respond to his or her chosen discipline. And if your discipline, like my second love after the Ford Mustang was economics, who I met just before my wife. So third is my wife.
It's chronological. Yeah. She doesn't watch her YouTube stuff. It's fine.
Oh, this is being recorded. Oh my gosh. Who, of course, has become first.
Yeah.
Anyway, but chronologically, my discipline, some disciplines work backwards. They say, here's what counts as an answer. Therefore, the only questions that count are the questions that can be answered with the method we have decided is the method of what counts as an answer. And, you know, today and every day in which economists talk, we're obsessed with causal identification. And if you don't have clean, and I love the word clean because it's like a ritual purity clean. They mean clean like a religion means clean. If you don't have clean identification, it can't be an answer to a question. And yet the questions that we're asking are going to be incredibly difficult to frame into a way in which the associated disciplines that dominate academia will recognize as an answer. And since they don't, you know, and if you've defined what counts as a question by the questions that you can answer, which has very much happened, then you can't get research in the academically publishable, academically rewarded way embedded in this. And, you know, looking at NOM, this is a first order challenge of attempting to integrate research and practice.
Yeah, go on.
Can I ask a question
Go on.
that directly follows?
Yeah, go on. Do you need a microphone? No?
Do we need microphones?
You want to come and, yeah.
Oh, it's...
Sorry.
I assume...
So when we talk about implementation science, how are we conceptualizing the thing that is being implemented? And I've started to worry about this because I think one reason why RISE had slippage issues in understanding what systems are is because systems is an abstract term, can mean all things to all people. I'm starting to worry about related slippage when we talk about implementation science. Because, for example, when we talk about implementation fidelity, and this is not the question of like fidelity versus adaptation, which is a separate issue. Because when we say an intervention was implemented well or implemented badly, that implies that the quality of the implementation can be separate. The quality of the intervention, its normative value, can be separated from whether there's a package of stuff that made it implementable or not. And I worry about this for two reasons. One is that I come from a country like many in the global south where people say, oh, we have lots of beautiful policies. Here is the paper they are printed on, and nothing happens. But also because who are we implicitly attributing responsibility to? Because if we say the intervention was implemented badly, that is implicitly maybe putting blame on the teachers, on the people in the district offices, rather than on the designers and those who should resource it. And I worry about power dynamics there. Yep. So what is it that we are implementing when we say science? Sorry.
Rachel, that, not to put you on the spot, but that kind of segues a little bit into the question, the kind of last question I was going to put to you. And do you want to take that one and run with it? It's not an easy one.
No, that's a big question there, Yuen. I think we could all give a go at answering it. And I absolutely don't think this is an issue of putting blame somewhere. And if we think about the system, it's about that complexity, that there are different actors have different responsibilities. And I think the problem is that we've tried to look at sort of a slither of that without understanding the whole. You may remember, and I see Janice in the room as well, Janice Dolan from FCDO, at the time when we used to talk about a whole school approach in terms of how we used to work with governments, and actually not taking just single interventions and thinking that would change things, but actually looking across the whole system. I think implementation science has to be about examining sort of those larger elements, therefore, and it's a little bit like Yamini was calling on us all yesterday, that we need to be kind of understanding the bureaucratic culture as well of the public system. I think some of the work that Deliver Ed has done in the last couple of years, the work that was presented earlier, Zara's here and Claire Lever and so on were doing, understanding what the incentives exist to change or not, and understanding what they are. Why do some teachers turn up and others don't turn up? Why do some, what are the constraints around, the larger social context? Why are some children not turning up? I mean, a lot of the issues on equity, I think, have been another area that we haven't addressed sufficiently. And yesterday we had Pauline Rose have a call for us to actually think more carefully and deeply about some of the gender issues. And even in our measures of, say, cost effectiveness, at the moment, we're not bringing equity into those at all. You know, we're blind to those broader distributions. And so it's sort of almost as if we've got this, well, there's a cost and there's a best buy, but actually it maybe look more cost effectiveness to give a girl, you know, a scholarship based on merit, but actually are we also concerned about a girl who may have a higher need? And so, you know, some of those more complex issues also need to be addressed, and we've been sort of hiding behind some of the numbers perhaps with those more complicated issues. But I think, you know, it does take us beyond. I mean, I think, you know, one of the most well-known studies coming out of RISE, for example, is that fabulous paper by Kartik and Abhijit's paper on, you know, the MP study that showed, you know, the school improvement plans not having an impact. And, you know, I think what we're saying with implementation science is, you know, the next step is then to understand, well, what were those issues, and are they shiftable? So, you know, they revealed that those were kind of pretty much carbon copies, and obviously it was just a bureaucratic tick box that was resulting in that not having an impact. So what is it that could change it? Would it be greater parental engagement? Would it be greater support to the head teachers to incentivize them producing it? Or is it about a responsiveness in terms of the resourcing that then would respond to those plans? They weren't, you know, they perhaps weren't incentivized because even if they had the plan, there was going to be no action resulting from those plans. And it's those broader questions that we need to be unpicking and unpacking and understanding if we're really going to make the shifts. And, you know, I think Christine Beggs at the back, you know, challenging us, you know, is 0.1 standard deviation sufficient? Is that sufficient? You know, are we content? You know, if we were on that level of change, Lant, I'd love to hear, as an economist, your trajectories. You know, where would we be on that learning trajectory? We probably wouldn't get very far in terms of shifting the game. So we need to be doing something differently. We need to be understanding the system more broadly.
I'm going to open out to any questions in the room now, Tahir. So, okay, there's a lot. Hang on. Let me do this side first. So, yeah, thank you.
You know, generals fight last, what does it say? The previous generation's battle. So before we start what works, we got to fight the RISE battle and work through the system before we can get to implementation. No, Lant, seriously, I mean, I think this is a good point, right? But there are ways of thinking about systems which are not ad hoc or anything, right? Mathematics has dynamical systems. And we have this idea of a state variable, which is slow to move, and then the control variable, and the elusive search for control variables, which at the World Bank became like growth regressions. Anything on the right-hand side could move and all that, and, you know, which went nowhere. So the point is that, you know, some of it is, how do you move a state variable? And I'd like to think that, you know, some of it is the hard problem, which you are describing, is what we call an equilibrium. You know, when things are in equilibrium, and particularly start thinking of intuition of a Nash equilibrium, where, you know, it's self-enforcing, nobody has an incentive to deviate and all that. It's a stable equilibrium of some sort. And all throughout, if we read economic history, other things, you know, we don't know, even if Vietnam exists and Pakistan exists and both are equilibria, right? Nash and many others have said, you know, just nobody knows really how to move. Theory doesn't tell us, at least, too much on how to move from one equilibrium to another one. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, I think that's a deep question about social change. So this is not just about technocratic solutions to various things. And this is like a problem which in economic history has been studied. There are different disciplines, sub-disciplines have studied. And I think this is a good way to think. And, you know, we did try to do it, right? In our idea about thinking about the village as a closed market, and therefore we could look at an equilibrium very locally. So it was an equilibrium, right? A market-based equilibrium, you shake it. It takes 20 years to study it, right? I mean, we are still waiting to see where it comes down. So part of the report card study is, but it has to be some idea of a general equilibrium, right? We don't know what the relationships are fixed. So my definition of a system really comes back to economics as an idea of a general equilibrium. So my sense is you move things, and then things have to work out endogenously afterwards. And then the question is, you know, as what is it, Schumpeter said, a new circular flow, as they said, right? I mean, that's what you're talking about. I mean, I think it takes time, and you have to really think about it. And then implementation is maybe just one of the shocks that you can try out. But you got to have some idea of figuring out how to study the system. And I don't think that in macro, the beloved field, it's really difficult to figure out what's going on with systems. The debates are endless, right? I mean, how do systems evolve, change? So my sense is that you got to think in localized ways of where the conceptual idea of the system still is there, but it's still, at least you can study it, you can shock it, you can trace it, you can see its evolution, you can see whether it comes to a new resting place. The challenge is, I mean, you put an impossible question, right? I mean, can we replicate China? Can we replicate Vietnam? Can we do this? Either you become like change the discipline, become comparative politics or something, which we, so I think that those are good questions. I think that we will have to think about it. I think that RISE at least forced us to think about a system. What do we mean really, even conceptually? And I think this will, I don't think we have an answer of what is implementation science, but at least we can start thinking about it. And where does it fit into some of these kind of disciplinary concepts? And is there a way to think about it? So, okay.
Thank you. Pass the mic behind, but as you're doing so, I'm super enthusiastic about those who have been involved in RISE, those who are involved in the What Works Hub, those others who are not involved in either, but have great love and affection for implementation science and systems thinking. I think let's make this a conversation of the various different reflections that you've got on this conversation too, and then you guys can choose which pieces of it to pick up as answers or just leave that as a useful, brilliant comment and contribution. But I'll take initially three comments or questions and then come back round. Sorry, go on.
Hi, I'm sort of just responding to some of the things I heard from all of you out there. One about sort of anthropology being important is possibly the only anthropologist in the room. Amen and hallelujah. But also, I mean, and I in response to sort of Lant's idea about what constitutes a discipline and sort of the circularity of what constitutes of a discipline. And also, yes, having just been part of this multi-method study and having sort of, as an anthropologist, I just want to sort of respond to some of what I have heard in this room and some of the troubling, almost low-level contempt for teachers that seem to run through some of the presentations. We've had speakers mention the teaching profession in a whole country is with poor cognitive skills. We've had situations where teachers, young women for the most part, working in low-fee private schools, often in the most exploited conditions, their classrooms being turned into game shows where money is thrown at you depending on your confidence levels and the decisions you take. I wonder, I'm sure that there is a lot of, research and great techniques behind it, but I just want to sort of push a little and say that perhaps you do need anthropologists, if only to remind everyone that teachers are humans, and that shouldn't need to be said, but that teachers and students are more than just data points. And I have just spent 2 years with teachers who, in the service of evidence-based research, have literally been dragged out of their classrooms to provide data on how their students learn instead of actually helping their students learn. So everyone here in this room who is part of the accountability data production machine that the Indian education system is increasingly becoming, I hope folks are also looking at themselves and what is this incentive structure that you have created for teachers as producers of data now versus teachers as producers of learning, and then use that very data to tell them they aren't doing their job seems to me to be fairly contradictory. So please, anthropology, if it is about systems, then there is no other science as whole and holistic in its approach as anthropology. Anthropology because human, and anthropology because clearly you said it, culture needs to change, maybe even the culture about how we think and talk about teachers.
Pritchett, super. One over here. And then I'll come back to you guys for anything.
Thank you very much. I think I have the perfect economist question to connect to what you just said. So, provocative way of seeing things could be, we are trying to heal many symptoms of educational systems that are in place by law, schools, for example, but they're often not working, sometimes maybe even discouraging independent learning, independent problem solving. So maybe should we just focus more on building different new systems, for example, explaining people how to use their phones to get all the knowledge of the world from the internet, how to learn how to find knowledge and solutions independently, how to improve their skills without being told so by school.
Thank you. I'll turn back to Lant and then Mpumi and Rachel. Any thoughts on those three wide-ranging comments and challenges? Ranging from how to move the equilibrium to should we do away with classrooms and teach kids how to use, how to navigate the internet?
Yeah, I think those were interesting comments. I don't have anything to say.
How can implementation science, I mean, I think there's been
some, one thing.
Yeah, go on.
I worry that, so, and I'm going to use a word that I barely know what it means, but ontology. Ontology is actually really important in deciding how one goes about researching something, because the ontological character of what you're researching influences what a science of that ontological entity would be, right? So there's behavioral sciences which are about the behavior of human beings, and human beings we understand really unbelievably well, right? Intuitively, right? And then there's the science of objects, which again, we understand we have amazing progress in the science of objects. But both implementation science and systems are talking about ontological things that are neither agents who are driven by a teleological desire to achieve certain ends, and then we understand agents in terms of why they're doing what they're doing, but we understand agents in the why. We understand objects like this table in terms of the what, but neither organizations nor systems are ontologically agents, nor are they ontologically objects. And so that creates a whole series of really deep questions of what a science of organizations looks like. And in the word implementation science, it's also not obvious what the most important unit is. Is it the organization, which is at least a legally fiction that's identifiable, or is it a system? And a system is, by definition, almost an amalgam of very different ontological objects. So anyway, so I'm just coming to even a bare minimum understanding of what the phrase implementation science might even mean in terms of what's the ontological character of the reference of the thing isn't settled by any stretch of the imagination.
There's a number of challenges, and maybe Noam wants to come in at some point on how the What Works Hub might want to respond to some of this stuff on day one of the inception phase, right?
I don't think we should put him on the spot. But.
Yeah. Rachel, do you have anything to add?
I just respond to the question from a fellow anthropologist. I think one of the things that actually we care a lot about is listening to the voices of teachers and also seeing positive outliers. And one example of that was recently in Kenya on a visit to a school in Kirinyaga, where they're wanting to do the Sobral, and walking past all of these empty, quiet kind of classrooms of buzzing teachers and going to this very quiet one at the end, wondering where they were taking me. And at the end there, we opened the, walked into that classroom, and there were 107 children in the classroom, with teacher Lucy at the front of that class holding the attention of every single child. And she had so many, and it was first term, that they all had cardboard round, their name plaques round their necks, so that she could call each one of them by their name and create that presence. And each one of those children actually could already read. And one of the things she was doing was teaching at the right level without it actually being called that. She was going around, she was asking them to use their tusomi finger and follow the reading. And in that way, as she walked around the class, she tapped some of them on the head, the ones who obviously weren't able to follow. And she then called them out. She said, "Today's angels, come to the front." And she was actually doing catch up. So, there's some amazing practice already going on. And some of this is about identifying that and looking at, well, how come in that school, when 2 classrooms away, there was chaos and really poor practice? Was it that there was a teacher in there holding every single child's attention? And I think some of us understanding implementation isn't just about external sort of experiments, but it's also about us pulling out those exemplars of good practice. And some of it's about understanding the bureaucratic challenges that prevent good things that could be good practice happening. So another example would be in Kenya, when I was up with staying in a boma up in the far north in the Samburu country, and the classroom still had, as in a lot of Kenya, had all the laptops locked in the cupboard. Now, you could complain and say, well, what was the head teacher doing with all the laptops still locked in the cupboard? And it wasn't that they didn't have technical support, because actually there was a Girls' Education Challenge technical support person who was helping them with another laptop initiative, which they were using. So why were all of, and they only had one of those, or I think maybe one per class, so had about 6 of those. And there were these just so many other laptops locked in the cupboard. And when you asked, it was a fear. It wasn't a lack of desire. She was a brilliant head teacher. She was afraid. None of those had been sold or lost, or they were all safely in the cupboard. But she hadn't been given the authority to go ahead and use them, and the support needed and the structures needed to need it. So part of the implementation science is understanding some of those and trying to unlock some of those issues in the system. So I think there's a lot of respect for teachers and their role, and actually how hard it is.
But that brings me back to, I guess, part of my question earlier of, if it were so easy, would we be doing it? Because there's been laptops, textbooks locked in classrooms for decades. There's been brilliant teachers found in pockets here, there, and everywhere, and isn't part of the problem in every school, in every country that we're talking about here, where 9 out of 10 kids can't read, is in some schools there's 10 different interventions, often not talking to each other, right? And for me, is there anything you'd like to add before we go out?
Just a quick comment on teachers. I think I hear the sentiment around teachers being spoken about as data points, and I think for the purposes of what we were presenting, that makes sense. But I think it's also a recognition that teachers are the best resource, that we have to change learning outcomes. I know in our context, parents are not it. We've had enough research, we've had COVID, etc., that show that teachers are still the best resource we have to teach reading or anything in schooling that is related to school. So they deserve the attention and the focus. The wording you use around them maybe can be different. And I think even the technology question around, could we just replace teachers with technology? I think not. And COVID, again, was great for that as an example that it's not possible. I know in our context, we have 95% public schools, and even of the private schools, not every single child had technology. So there's still a massive need for a teacher as a facilitator, even if they incorporate technology. So yeah, maybe there are other contexts where that's a viable idea.
I thought we had 10 minutes left. We've got 3. So I'm really sorry to those who put their hands up and wanted to ask questions. We've got drinks immediately after this, and this partly, I think, why we have 3, because we don't want to delay you getting to the drinks. Please find Lant, Mpumi, and Rachel during the drink session and ask them those burning questions. I wanted to ask Noam and then Rachel if you wanted to finish on anything related to the What Works Hub, and Noam answer that question of how is implementation science going to fix it all?
Thank you. I actually have a question, if I can, but maybe you won't get to answer it. I thought Tahir was going to share this. In the break, he came up to me and he said, if I can share this, Tahir, he said, if they had to write a book about me, they would write 0.1 standard deviation. So we haven't managed to exceed 0.1 standard deviation. So it's hard to get to 0.8 or all children learning. I just thought that was a funny moment there, saying that this aspiration we've set, it is really hard, because it's true, the median effectiveness is 0.1. So we're really a far way away. But I will say our goal as the What Works Hub is to make progress and to make sure more children are learning, and we understand rigorously how to do that. So one question I have for the panel, but I don't know if you can answer it in 3 minutes, is now that we're shifting from this theme of systems to implementation, what do you think we should keep common so we don't lose the amazing work that's happened over the last period? And what do you think we actually should do differently as we move to implementation? So that was my question. And I also realized when I was up there, I didn't actually say who I was. So that was I'm going to be the academic director, or I am the academic director of the What Works Hub. So I'm listening very closely. So thank you.
Super. Why don't we finish with each of you giving 30 seconds on the response to Noam?
Sure. I think the systems thinking aspect is still key. Mm-hmm. I think that there was a question earlier around, like, do we blame teachers? I think that would be incorrect. It's understanding what your program was, what you're doing, and at every level. So you know, are you having a design failure, a delivery failure, a bureaucratic failure, a service provider failure, etc. And so that whole systems thinking, system strengthening, system scaling, I think is important. I don't think it should be a competition between systems and implementation.
Mm-hmm. Lant.
I think in order to create a sub-discipline of implementation science, you need to change the conception of research from evaluating the impact of an intervention to evaluating the impact of the initiation of a process, and then trace the process as part of the research. So it isn't just implementation of did they do it, because otherwise you're intrinsically in top-down mode. Yeah. Right? Because the intervention is pre-designed and implementation is a separate stage. And so anyway, and figuring out how to make that an acceptable, rigorously methodological thing is, I think, the first order issue for the research and academic component of the What Works Hub, because that's how things happen. They happen as a process. I have jargon about this, like crawl of the design space versus, most RCT is we're going to attempt to evaluate a specific design, as opposed to we're going to initiate a process in which the system is crawling the design space to find something effective. And how you research that process is, I think, the key.
Rachel, last minute.
I would say three things, Noam, to your question. I think let's continue to be producing that incredible quality of robust evidence that we saw in the graph. But let's make sure it's costed. And in that costing, let's also consider equity. The second thing is, I think we need to do what Lant has said, is actually perhaps it's wrongly named as the What Works Hub, to think about this being the How Works Hub. And I think that's a challenge to you and the team, Noam. And I think the last thing is, on this discipline, let's be ambitious on implementation science. As Tahir and others said, we're at the beginning of the journey of even thinking about what implementation science really means. But perhaps we need to be ambitious and have, even a journal. I don't think special issues will cut it. We need journals where people can publish on this, where they have the academic incentives that allow them to be professional in the space. And I hope that community of practice that has been just so phenomenal in RISE continues to grow, and it grows with all of those you nurture from the Global South as well, so that in the future they are leaders and their leaders support the children of the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Green job.